found an interesting paper that's been published in a journal called PLOS Biology, and has been written up as well in some of the science media, which looks at the role of artificial intelligence in some papers looking at questions to do with health, and in particular, what factors might predict whether someone is going to suffer from a particular a disease or health issue. Now, there's some ways you can analyze these data really quite easily with artificial intelligence. So you can download a big database of health outcomes and predictors of those health outcomes, like age and sex and where you live and how much you earn. And then you can do a big dredge through these data with artificial intelligence, and it spits out some results, and then you look through those results and you decide to report ones that you like the look of. The problem is, that's not necessarily the right statistical way in which to analyze these data, because often health issues, like much of the things in the living world, are really much more complicated than single, relatively simple correlations. There's lots of things that interact together in order to perhaps make you depressed or make you obese or suffer from cardiovascular disease. So, but people are doing these analyses with artificial intelligence, and then they send them off to papers, to journals rather, where those papers that have been submitted are peer-reviewed, and then they come out and are published. And so what this paper in PLOS One did is it did what's called a systematic review. So it did a big search for this type of analysis that can be done really easily with artificial intelligence, to see whether the type of analysis has become more popular since the tools became available. And they have found a staggering increase, almost an exponential growth, in the number of these papers that are being produced and are being submitted to journals and being published. And the problem with this is the people who did this, the expert medics who did this, chose diseases and chose to focus in particular on studies where we know there are lots of different factors that can cause those diseases. And then they found these papers that provided much simpler analyses that can be done very simply with artificial intelligence. I should say more complicated analyses can also be done with artificial intelligence, but they're actually harder to do. So why does this matter? Well, it matters for a number of reasons. First of all, the way you progress in academia and get jobs is through publishing papers. So there is a temptation, certainly in some parts of the world, for scientists to try and use AI to get papers quickly. And in fact, most of these papers that this review identifies come out of China. Second, it's flooding the scientific literature with fairly dubious and wrong conclusions. And so that's kind of dangerous for the development for drugs and diagnosis of health diseases if it's not picked up. And so the authors of this paper sort of send a warning, but also come up with some recommendations in terms of how these AI approaches can be identified and can be checked to make sure they don't get in there. Another problem with this, of course, is it's now quite easy to write a paper using AI and to do these analyses, so you get some fairly formulaic writing, and then this increases the burden on other scientists who are asked to peer review these papers. Now, I don't want to have a big downer on AI, because AI can be an incredibly useful tool in science if used properly. Indeed, we've used it in my group, where we've linked artificial neural networks to ordinary differential equations to help identify dynamical patterns in systems. I mean, we wrote the code ourselves, we developed the methods ourselves, mainly led by my postdoc, Willem Bonifay. So, that's a useful tool that other people can use. But, like pretty much everything, AI is creeping into our lives, sometimes in incredibly useful ways, but sometimes in risky ways. And I thought that this was an interesting paper, an interesting report, because it shows that AI is even creeping into the production of scientific papers, and in this case, in medicine, in not a particularly helpful way. Anyway, I hope that's interesting, and I hope if you want to read more, you can go and look for the paper in PLOS One, and that's a journal where all papers are open access, so anyone can download it and read it. Okay.